I'm Afshin Rattansi. You're watching a special edition of Going Underground as David Cameron prepares for British bombing of Syria, not this time against President Assad, but against President Assad's enemies. We talk to one of NATO imperialism's greatest chroniclers, John Pilger. The award-winning journalist and filmmaker tells us how Washington, London and Paris gave birth to ISIS-Daesh.
And we'll review the week's news, from fire in the Syrian sky to a cyber attack sinking feeling over Trident.
All this and more on today's Going Underground. Today is the UK Autumn Statement. 1 minute British Chancellor George Osborne says we have to cut working tax credits for 3 million of Britain's most vulnerable because of the Western economic crisis. The other, his leader David Cameron, wants to spend tens of billions on war to be a leading member of NATO. NATO, whose member Turkey attacked the Russian military within the past 24 hours. Since the Paris attacks, there will be no massive increase in police budgets. We'll instead be buying more extrajudicial assassination drones, and we'll have 24 instead of 8 of these fighter jets by 2023, whose engine design and budget is seen here being discussed by President Obama's former defense secretary.
We have recommended for several years now against funding this engine, considering it a waste of money, and to argue that we should add another $3 billion in what we regard as waste to protect the $1.5 billion that we believe already has been wasted. Frankly, I don't track the logic.
Got that? No? Well, an entire US government commission suggested cancelling procurement of F-35 warplanes. Apparently, the most expensive US military project in history is wholly unsuited to fighting asymmetric wars. No wonder David Cameron on Monday was talking about Ukraine. Osborne's new F-35s are much better suited to fighting a war with Russia than ISIS. For many, George Osborne's autumn statement is packed with corruption. Handling his social security programs will be outsourcing companies closely allied to politicians, but one of the biggest beneficiaries will be the UK's biggest manufacturing company, BAE Systems. It's BAE which makes the F-35s with Lockheed Martin, whose shares have soared since attacks in France, Egypt, Lebanon, Mali and Nigeria. That's BAE, closely allied to Saudi Arabia, from where ISIS-Daesh draws its funding. The media was in full propaganda mode for another UK war in the Middle East even before Britain's NATO ally Turkey shot down Russian soldiers fighting ISIS. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Crispin Blunt, to whom David Cameron replies in the coming hours in an unprecedented reaction to a Select Committee report, is on Saturday's Going Underground. Already, Cameron has given French bombers the use of Britain's base in Cyprus from which to conduct bombing raids on Syria. But unlike Russia, France is bombing without President Assad's permission and in support of Syrian rebels. With me is one of the world's greatest journalists who knows better than most about the impact of imperial wars, from Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos to the British Labour Party's catastrophic wars on Afghanistan and Iraq, and to David Cameron's destruction of the richest country in Africa, Libya. His new film, American Power in the Asia Pacific, and its new challenge from China is out next year. John Pilger, thanks for coming back on Going Underground. So how are ISIS the progeny of Washington, London and Paris?
Oh, they are not only the progeny, they are the fully grown-up, manic, adolescent creature belonging to Paris, London, Obama, and the United States. Without the support of these three countries, without the arms that have been given to ISIS, either they've been given directly to Jabhat al-Nusra and have gone to ISIS, or they've gone the other way, or they've gone to the Wahhabists in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar. But the French, the British, the Americans and the Turks have all supplied those who have kept ISIS going. You know, if David Cameron had won his Commons vote a couple of years ago, ISIS would now be in charge in Syria. In other words, the Middle East's most multi-ethnic, multicultural state would be finished. And these fanatics would be in charge, and that would be thanks entirely to Western actions. Western actions that are reinforced by our propaganda. Propaganda is so powerful now. I've never known really a time when propaganda has played such an important part. And that includes 2003, when propaganda allowed Blair to go ahead with Bush and invade Iraq. I mean, here we have this orchestrated hysteria following the terrible events in Paris being reported so selectively, so rapaciously. Just now, The Guardian has admitted that it suppressed comment that might suggest that Western policies had something at all to do with ISIS and the attacks on Paris. And we know that Cameron has ignored everything that Blair was told by all the intelligence and security agencies, from MI6 all the way through. We had the former ambassador Oliver Miles saying that, just reeling off all those government institutions that warned Blair that if he attacked Iraq, then it would come back, there would be blowback. Nothing less would inspire young Muslims to go and fight on the side of the fanatics. Cameron knows all that. I mean, is this man serious? Is he a serious human being? That we really need to ask that. Or is he just this kind of verbose sociopath, as he comes across now as, with his ludicrous policies?
You quote in your updated article, which harks back to the bombing of Cambodia to explain events today, you quote the former French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas saying that British officials in London were talking to him about Cameron's support for regime change, for destabilizing Syria. Would you appeal to someone to leak that information? He said he couldn't go into more detail because for fear of litigation himself.
Yeah, well, that was 2013. Dumas, in an interview on French television, said that he was happened to be in England, and he was invited in to see people in the government and asked if he would like to take part in a project they had, and that project was an attack on Syria. But, you know, that's 2013. We can go back to the 1950s when the British intelligence was plotting the end of the regime in Syria. Syria's crime, Syria's main crime, is that it is independent, and it stands against Israel dominating that part of the world. It stands with, these days, with Iran. It stands with the other opponents, Hezbollah, now with Russia. There is no question that if there was an election tomorrow, all those minorities that look to this government in Damascus for all its violations of human rights, and no one doubts those, look to it as its protector, because the alternative is ISIS. And everything the West has done has been to create first the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, then with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, then in 2011, the invasion and destruction of Libya. That probably was the crucial, that was the turning point. The French, the British, the Americans, less so in this adventure, was mainly the French and the British. Since then, Hollande has openly sold arms to Jabhat al-Nusra. The arms of French rocket launchers have ended up with ISIS. This year in April, it did I think a $6-7 billion deal for French jets with Qatar, and it did a $12 billion deal in June with Saudi Arabia.
But then I suppose David Cameron in the next few hours may be making the case that, okay, maybe those were mistakes, but you're an appeaser if you believe that the threat of bombs in British cities in response to a Syria bombing campaign should make us avert our eyes and not bomb even what we created?
But you know as well as I know why you have to ask it, but that's a sort of ludicrous...
There'll be the argument.
That's a ludicrous suggestion.
Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet members will be making this argument.
Well, the Labour Party have been almost as much a party to this horrendous state of affairs in the Middle East. I mean, the Marn news agency have just published a day in the life of Palestine, all being ignored, with one Israeli crime after the other. We have in Israel, you know, what is effectively a lawless and terrorist state protected by Britain, by the United States, by France, and by the EU. The EU, which does deals with Israeli arms companies. So much money has been made out of the suffering of people in the Middle East. And those arms deals that the French have just done, just think about that. Put that against this rather strutting plastic little Napoleon that Hollande has presented himself as in the last few days. We are at war, the Republic is at war. Well, sure, yeah, he's at war and he's supplying the wherewithal, the arms for that war, for the very enemy that he denounces. This kind of double standard now, this hypocrisy, has become so much part of our public life, such an underpinning to so much media now, that I think people are understanding much more than they're given credit for.
Do you think that Washington, which has been helping PKK affiliates, that happening on one side, Britain supposedly wanting to combat ISIS now, whilst being friendly with Turkey, shows that the NATO alliance is finally in a sort of terminal disarray?
They certainly are intact enough to do an enormous amount of damage. Their last big adventure in Libya is probably the prime reason that there is so much turmoil now and there is so much fanaticism. The Russians, Putin it seems to be one of the most serious people involved in the Middle East. He pointed out that the long lines of trucks, ISIS trucks that are stealing Syria's oil, haven't been bombed haven't been interdicted during the so-called Western war against ISIS. The Western war against ISIS has been a farce. While feeding the monster of the fanaticism through Jabhat al-Nusra, through ISIS, apparently through something called the Free Syrian Army, which as we now know doesn't exist, in effect doesn't exist.
Coming up in part 2 of Going Underground, John Pilger examines the media's role in spreading disinformation ahead of a vote in Parliament for UK bombing of Syria.
And we'll review the week's news, including boosts for Boeing and the BBC World Service.
All this and more after a short break. Welcome back. In the second part of our interview with award-winning journalist John Pilger, we turn to the first casualty of war, truth, as disseminated by our mainstream media. Well, let's go to the media now. Did it surprise you how the Murdoch press reacted to Paris and seemed to do exactly what ISIS would have wanted journalists to do?
It's not only the Murdoch press. It's like saying in the United States, is it surprising that the Fox News had behaved like Fox News? Well, in this country, the Murdoch press behaved like the Murdoch press. The Daily Mail behaves like the Daily Mail. We shouldn't be surprised. But now we have right across the board, and that includes serious papers, papers who claim to their readers that they have some gravity, some conscience, like The Guardian, being part of this orchestration, for the escalation of war in that part of the world. When The Guardian suppresses comment that that should be patently obvious to anybody that it is the West that has created this monster of killing and suffering and of dispossession in the Middle East.
Do you think when, I mean, a lot of Tony Blair's old friends, obviously on the Guardian newspaper, we don't want to just pick on that paper, the Observer did support the 2003 war.
No one always suggests that there is a serious side to the press. That pretension is very important to certain newspapers. It's a pretension very important to the BBC, and it's very important to the Guardian. But the propaganda is even more lethal because it comes from sources of news that have credibility.
Well, when Jeremy Corbyn presumably exterminates those remnants of the Blairite Labour Party that I suppose the accusations are guilty of war crimes, will that change things in the media representation of wars?
I don't know. I can't imagine personally, and I wish Jeremy Corbyn all the luck in the world, but I can't imagine the Labour Party changing. It's a warlike party, and it has been that. It has a number of people in its shadow cabinet who are just eager to bomb. It's a warlike party. The media has always beaten the drums of war. You had journalists, I made a film with journalists saying in it, had it not been, had the lies about Iraq been questioned, had Blair's lies been questioned instead of being amplified, then that war might not have happened. That certainly was true in America. You have very distinguished journalists who've said that had the propaganda not been allowed to run its course, that had journalists done their job and questioned the propaganda, challenged the propaganda, that war might not have happened. I'm not sure about that myself, but it's an interesting idea because you know, almost 1 million people died as a result of that invasion.
And what about the divisions within society? I mean, the Sun headline, 1 in 5 Muslims would support ISIS, thus the kind of thing ISIS presumably would want to have create divisions.
I don't believe anything in the Sun, really.
But when it comes to even the refugee crisis, as you say, on the BBC regularly we hear kind of attempts at trying to say we need a fortress Britain and it's the fault of refugees.
Well, the fortress Britain hasn't paid off. What can you do about somebody who decides to blow themselves up? There's almost no defense to that. So what you do is you go to the cause. The cause. Those bombs on the 7th of July 2005 were Blair's bombs that went off in London. So much of the suffering of people, the terrorist attacks and so on can be brought back to actions taken at great remove in distance and culture by the leaders of Western governments. Going back to Afghanistan in the 1980s, when the architect of the creation of the Mujahideen as an organization built to overthrow the Soviet Union, basically, that was admitted by Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, who set it up. And we've seen this support for fanaticism, Islamic fanaticism, by Western governments, right, you can go further back. Go back to the time when the Muslim Brotherhood, at its most fanatical, was given a place to organize in the offices of the Suez Canal Company, then controlled by Britain. Read Mark Curtis's extraordinary book about this alliance between imperial Western governments and Muslim, and the creation of Muslim fanaticism. While doing that, demanding that the one government that could stand up to them, that's Damascus, be overthrown.
Is the only beginning of a solution, you mentioned Palestine, for Britain to sever ties or whatever, do something about Israel-Palestine? Is that the way to outflank ISIS and its propaganda?
We could have a wish list, couldn't we? You know, the wish list is, at the top of the wish list is there has to be a concerted effort, clearly, to stop the destruction of Syria, the final destruction. The second priority should be all the parties negotiating a way to deal with ISIS. I can't imagine that happening.
Finally, then, who wins out of this? Of course, today is the Chancellor's autumn statement. Who is winning out of all this turmoil?
Well, the people who are killed in Paris are not winning, are they? And the people who are killed in Palestine are not winning. And the people who were killed by ISIS in Beirut, who the media all but ignored, are not winning. So all those people who suffer and are maimed, all those 700,000 widows in Iraq, they're certainly not winning. It has to stop. And in my view, it will only stop when people force their governments to stop. Now, how that is done, I can't really say, but that certainly is the only solution that is left to us now.
John Pilger, thank you. Broadcaster and former Member of Parliament Lembit Opik now joins me to go through some of the week's headlines. And of course, the autumn statement, maybe the most vulnerable aren't beneficiaries, but Mr. Trident appears to be a beneficiary.
Yes, well, it's not exactly a beneficiary story, this one. Lots of money for the military, but this is a warning in The Guardian. Trident could be vulnerable to cyber attack, former Defence Secretary says. Des Brown has been very critical of the fact that we could be vulnerable to attacks from enemies abroad in a very technical way. He says that Trident's replacement could be obsolete before it's even introduced. Why? Because he doesn't think we've made enough investment in protecting ourselves against a proven method of destabilising your opponents. He hasn't really got many solutions for this. It's an old story, and it's hard to know who to believe, really.
What a waste of money. Nearly as big a waste of money as our Nimrod. What is that? Edward Elgar's piece of music. We abolished it, destroyed it, and now we're going to recommission this piece of music.
The music survives, but it's a lot cheaper than what this is about. The Telegraph sums it up. Boeing is the big winner from David Cameron's defence review. Britain was going to replace its spy planes, the ones that find submarines. Let's not kid ourselves, Russian submarines, that's what they were there for. And then £3.4 billion was spent building them and scrapping them before they even flew. They actually got broken up. Now, in the current panic stations environment, they've decided to recommission it. But hold on a minute, not British planes, Boeing 737s from America converted to do the same job. What a massive waste of money. It's just a big circle. Maybe we need them, maybe we don't. We should have thought about that 4 years ago.
Well, we are kind of fighting the United States by our support for Turkey, which means that at least we can help American manufacturing industry while we fight the PKK affiliates who are backed by the United States while Russia bombs the rebels in Syria.
Can I have a lie down now?
It is difficult to understand, isn't it?
It's actually impossible to understand.
But luckily, there are propaganda outlets waiting in the wings to explain everything to the British people and beyond, according to your next story, from the BBC, the billion-pound broadcast media organisation that people still believe.
No envy there, Afshin. The BBC says of itself, BBC World Service gets funding boost from government. It seems that in this review, they're limbering up to give £85 million a year, not straight away, but eventually, to help with the broadcasting in Russia, North Korea, the Middle East and Africa. There's a very interesting analysis by David Silito, who's the media correspondent. He says...
of the BBC covering the BBC here.
Yes,
yeah, I believe
it is.
Yeah.
But I think this is right. That actually makes this more poignant. The money is all about soft power, Britain's reputation, values and influence around the world. He's pulling no punches. It's clear this is a media war to help try to avoid putting boots on the ground.
So an admission that the BBC is propaganda, which explains all the bizarre headlines when the Turkish government, it seems, deliberately tried to down, and did down, a Russian jet, either in Syrian airspace or Turkish airspace. Do you see any of the propaganda? We know it's propaganda from this article.
The BBC wouldn't say it's propaganda. What's interesting about
they call it soft power.
that's as far as they go with it.
I didn't realise I'm soft power for the Kremlin. Are we saying anything for the Kremlin here? We've got to communicate Britain's reputation, values and influence around the world. That is propaganda. Look, I hardly think that I'm here to communicate Russian reputation, values and influence around the world here on this channel.
Lord Hall says, easy Tiger, he says, the millions announced today will help the BBC deliver our commitment to uphold greater global democracy through accurate, impartial, independent news reporting. Winners write the history, depends which side you see on it.
Well, let's go to the Murdoch newspaper of choice, the best-selling paper in this country. Tony Gallagher, City University graduate, presumably okayed this one.
The Sun, 1 in 5 Brit Muslims sympathy for jihadis.
20% of every Muslim community in Britain.
1 in 4.
ISIS.
1 in 4 between 18 and 34-year-olds. It doesn't say that they're actually supporting ISIS. It seems that the report, and it's hard to get into the actual raw data from the newspaper review, it seems that there is some sympathy for what's happening in terms of radicalisation.
You believe this newspaper at all?
Yes, I do to an extent. But not
this is absolutely absurd. YouGov, the accurate polling organisation, refused to do the poll for the Sun because they said there's no way they could get these figures.
Whether these figures are right or not isn't the point. There's no doubt that there's a groundswell of support in some communities which shows some sympathy for what's going on there. We can stick our head in the sand if we want to. We just talked about propaganda. If we want to fool ourselves into thinking that nothing is going on in the UK, then let's ignore this. I'm not disputing that the Sun needs a bit of corroboration here. Bottom line is, something's happening in these communities, and ironically, maybe the Sun is more on the money than you're giving it credit to.
Well, ISIS would certainly love this headline, and Donald Trump too, with his yellow star. Pin badges on Muslims. That's the only way we're going to stop the war on terror. This seems to be playing exactly into ISIS's hands.
It's a warning sign. You can say, let's not talk about it, or we can say, if we think there's just a military solution, then we are fooling ourselves. Or do I sound a little bit too much like Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, even he doesn't want to negotiate with ISIS. See you next week, Lembit, or sometime.
Maybe.
That's it for today, but join us again on Saturday when we speak to the chairman of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Crispin Blunt, about why David Cameron is wrong on Syria. Get in touch via social media. Watch RT UK News with Bill Dodd on the hour from 7 till 10. See you on Saturday, 72 years to the day, World War II allies Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Iran to open a second front against Germany.